Welcome to the Blaze and Bush podcast. I'm Jeff Bush, and along with my co-host Jim Blaze, we are here to share with you authentic stories of God's extraordinary revelation in ordinary lives. Our hope is that, like Moses in the burning bush in Exodus 3, you may encounter the Lord through these humble experiences. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. Jim, it's been a while.
It has. We've had a bit of a hiatus, and I've missed it.
I have too. You know, we had a planned break after our last episode in November.
Right.
Where we were going to take a few weeks off, but I think there have been some unique circumstances in addition to Christmas and
right.
all of that goodness. You, in your excellent soccer skills, broken ankle, had surgery.
You should see the other guy.
I know. It's too bad you did it by yourself in open space, too.
That's true. That's true, actually.
Your athletic prowess must have really been on display at that moment.
You know how you make moves, usually in basketball, and they're so good they call it an ankle breaker?
Yeah.
Yeah, I did that to myself.
That's, I mean, you faked yourself right out of your own socks.
It's a new level.
It is a new level.
Yeah. So anyway, but yes, recovering from that actually took a lot more time and was a lot more draining than I expected it to be. So that was part of it. However, the bigger part really.
Yeah, the bigger part really in what we want to do today is have a reflection really on this individual and what was very challenging, especially for myself personally and for my family, was the passing of my spiritual director, Mr. Bob Frey.
Yes.
Bob is a man that I think, you know, Jim, we normally have guests on our show, and today we have a guest, but it's being done in a different format.
Right. And he is, in fact, one of those people that we always had on our list as a future guest. And so it's fitting that on our return to podcasting, that the first episode after his passing is on him. So it seems totally appropriate that we should take the time to acknowledge his role both in your formation, which is significant, but also as an influence for the parish that we belong to. It was not just you that he impacted. He impacted so many people, and his spirit was so exemplary of how we are to follow Christ that it's worth sharing with all the listeners.
So we're going to take a different approach to the episode today. As opposed to sitting down and hearing our guests and interviewing our guests in relation to how God has revealed themselves in their ordinary lives, we're going to take some time to reflect specifically on the last year of our relationship with Mr. Bob.
Yeah, because in this case, the question is not how did God reveal himself to Bob Frey, but the question is how did God reveal himself through Bob? And I think that's what we want to reflect on today.
So for those of you listening to the podcast that are unfamiliar with Mr. Bob, I mean, Jim, how would you describe him physically so this can sort of paint a picture for those listening?
So he had unique characteristics. He was not tall. He was not a tall man. And so he didn't stand out in that way, but he had, a white head of hair and this unique beard. It's hard to describe. It was not ZZ Top. It was not quite that,
skinny Santa Claus.
It was exactly. That's so it was about chest high, I would say, or even a little shorter than that, but not broad like a Santa Claus sort of idea. But you're right. I think the skinny Santa Claus beard is a fair description.
Yeah, he was a thin man, and the beard sort of followed the linear fashion of his body shape, and just such a cool way. And as a man that really can't grow facial hair, like, I was a little envious.
I get that. I'm the same way. So, yeah, we're both the clean-shaven folk, but he pulled it off really well.
He did, and it made sense. It just did.
He looked monastic.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's the impression you had. And even in the way he carried himself, the only thing that was lacking were robes. If he had worn like a gray robe, I would have immediately assumed that he was part of an order. But just the manner in which he walked, I mean, it's hard to describe. He walked with humility. You know what I mean?
He did. And as I was reflecting, as we were getting ready for this conversation today, I started writing down, if somebody asked me, how would you describe the character of this man? So we've give him a little bit of sort of this physical impression. But when you begin to think about character, you think about certainly the obvious. You think about loving. You think about kindness. You think about, the most humble man perhaps many have ever met, certainly myself.
For sure.
And I began to think, Jim, I'm like, this does not do justice.
Yeah.
For Bob.
It's one of those things. I think about, like, my children. They don't know now St. John Paul II, right? But I grew up in his pontificate. But when you tried to describe it to them, when you tried to describe the impact he had on you, you can't. It goes beyond words. Even though you, in a certain sense, you can describe what he did and what he said, but you can't describe the impact it had on you. And Mr. Bob, he was the same way. He had that truly saintly quality where his words went deeper than people realized. He could touch on the inner parts of what was going on.
I wrote down 3 things, and I want to share them with you because I think they're very powerful. First, Bob loved you before you knew him.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, he desperately wanted you to know and to love Jesus Christ. And thirdly, if I only had one, I would say when people saw Bob, they saw Jesus.
Yeah.
That's how he carried himself. He was loving and kind and humble, but he was a quiet and gentle man. And when you start really talking about this and really reflecting on it, somebody else does come to mind.
Yeah.
And it is Jesus.
Right?
Jesus put you always in front of him. He loved you before we ever realized. And all he wanted was a loving relationship with you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's without a doubt that God's intent and God's purpose was to be a radiant light shining through Mr. Bob's heart as he walked through the latter stages of his life.
Yeah. That was part of his greatness. He was so unassuming, but when he spoke to you, like we would be in a crowded area, the vestibule at church, and when he spoke to you, it was like no one else was there. It was you and him.
Absolutely.
And it was captivating. He would just be in this conversation and you would feel like you are the most interesting person in the world, even if you're, droning on and on about whatever, your day, your family, whatever. But he would just be so focused on you, and you could feel the love that emanated. It was really beautiful.
His presence was powerful.
Yeah.
And powerful is a strange word when you think of him, when you look at him and know him, because it may be like a gentle giant is perhaps. He's a small man.
Right.
But he's so very careful in how he spoke. He was so present in conversations with those around him that, I never really thought about that, but thinking now about conversations I've had with him, you could have had a a circus running around the room and not have heard it.
He would have been totally unaffected because he was talking to you. And that was really his charism, his gift was being so able to love the person in front of him that he could not help but become that focused. I think that's exemplary. I think, when I reflect back on who he was and who he is, it's that I want to be like that. You know what I mean? I want to be that kind of person. And that takes a conscious effort, right? I think of all the conversations I have, and usually I have something going through my head, right? Like I don't get distracted easily.
What's that? I was thinking.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I'm kidding.
And so I'm usually on topic, but I'm on my topic, right?
Oh, without a doubt. We enter almost every conversation that we have thinking of what is next.
Yes. I'm figuring out while you're talking what I'm going to say, and I'm not listening as well as I should. And that's that Bob had down to not a science, but he had it. It was just, he was so full of love. That's what he did. He listened. And I feel like that is an example of who Christ is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So 8 a.m. Mass. So you and I are frequently there, and Bob and his wife, we're always there.
Yes.
And one morning after Mass, so I had been sitting in the pew right behind them for quite some time and didn't know Bob and his wife Jody. And one day after Mass, he came up behind me, and right when I stood up, he was right there. And it was one of those moments where I did not know at all what was going to be happening next. And he said, "Can we get a cup of coffee sometime?"
Nice.
And man, Jim, there's no way I possibly could have anticipated what that question to me and that invitation to me would mean. Mm-hmm. And not only to me, but to Bob, to my children, to my wife, to my family, my extended family.
Yeah.
That simple cup of coffee, that invitation was transformational.
Yeah.
And Bob's probably someone that I would never have asked on my own behalf to go have a cup of coffee. Mainly because I would have been nervous about every other word I would have said, would have not felt holy enough to be worthy of that conversation. He's pointing a finger down at us right now too when we say some of these things, because he is the last person on earth that would want us to be talking about him. So we ended up going and grabbing a cup of coffee, and it was just a casual conversation. He asked a lot of questions. He wanted to get to know me. Mm-hmm. A lot of times somebody might ask you to grab a cup of coffee or for a meeting or for lunch or for a conversation. And it's kind of like there's almost always an agenda.
They want you to get to know them. You know what I mean? Or their goal, or they want you to get to know something. They want to reveal something to you, but he wanted to see you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, we sat there for a good hour plus, and I'm not sure he said 10 words.
Oh, wow.
And it was just that his presence was drawing out of me some very, very deep and personal stuff. I was vulnerable from the moment we sat down.
Right.
And I'm a pretty open book, but nothing like that conversation. Mm. And we walked away. It was kind of a look at your watch moment where you're like, oh man, what time is it? Wow, I've done nothing but talk about myself. And he mentioned to me, he said, by the way, can we get together for another cup of coffee sometime? And I was like, yeah, because I absolutely want to learn about you.
Yeah.
Like, here is this man that has this really cool beard that I want to get to know, because he's clearly holier than I am. Like, there's a lot I can learn.
Right.
So, and not to get into this too deeply, but we sit down in the next conversation, and I'm like, I mean, you got to tell me about you. And he's like, no, I got more questions for you. And it was like, dang. But we sort of opened up this conversation and this comfort level. That's actually, I'm sitting here, it's hard to describe.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it was different. It was not parental.
Right.
It was not, I hadn't known this man.
Right.
And it's different than talking to a priest. You know, and it's different than even, you know, when you and I first sat down and I had questions about the faith and we were going through RCI, it was different than I felt talking to you. Or you know, it's different than talking to a spouse or...
Right.
Have you ever had like that kind of just complete comfort? I mean, I'm struggling to describe it, to be honest with you.
Right. Right. No, it's a gifted relationship.
But we actually opened from that point on. He became my dedicated spiritual director.
Right.
And we would spend a couple of hours every other week, and had from that moment until really the week before he had passed.
Wow.
Spending time, and man, without a doubt, the most selfless individual I'd ever met.
Yeah. In every sense of that word. You know, that's some of that we've talked about before, is he wanted to know you, you know. He didn't care about himself. He wasn't concerned about what you thought of him. He wasn't concerned about that you saw what a great guy he was. He wanted to know about you. He wasn't even trying to show off. I know people who listen well to others, but they still have an agenda. Like, they still, you know what I'm saying?
So I do. So I always felt like he would ask me a very simple question. Like, it could be, how are you?
Right.
And he asked the question because he cared.
Right.
Because he truly wanted to know how I was. And actually, I was watching my wife had pointed me to this talk that Father Mike Schmitz had done here recently at a conference in Arizona, just at the turn of the year here.
Okay.
And it was all about being fine. And so often people say, I'm fine.
Right.
When Bob asked me how I was, I never said I was fine.
Right.
In fact, the poor man would have to listen to me talk about everything that was going on in my life before he even took a breath.
But that's what he wanted, right? And there's a confidence in that he had already demonstrated. You know what? No, I want to know what's going on. I want to understand what's going on inside your life. And so we can have confidence in that. You know, for a lot of people, it's just a form of greeting. Hey, how are you? And then you move on to the next step. You give a short answer and you move on to the next step to get to the real conversation. But for him, how are you? That was the real conversation. I mean, that's how caring he was, is that he really wanted to know, and he wouldn't let it drop. I'm confident if you had come back with fine. You know, he would have.
Oh, that would have been unacceptable.
Exactly.
Actually, he would have seen right through it.
Yes.
And would have had a follow-up question.
Right.
I never said fine. Yeah. Sadly enough, I'm sitting here. I'm not sure I ever asked him how he was doing. Although I sort of kind of knew that.
But you know what? He emanated joy. He emanated peace. He was one of those characters who was just, you knew he was great. And he was happy. Obviously, at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Christ begins with the Beatitudes, right? And it says, happy are the poor in spirit. And if you go through every single one of those, happy are the peacemakers, happy are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. You go through every single beatitude, Bob was happy in the way that those little statements describe. He was truly a blessed man. He was truly a happy man. And it came from a place that was sincere, that was really eternal in hindsight. We can see that. It was a place of a relationship with God that he was pleased no matter the place he was or circumstances. And that's, I think, again, a gift of his.
If you would ask him how he was. So I know I have asked him this question.
Yeah.
Because his response was always, I am so blessed.
Yeah. And again,
he meant it.
That's it. That's it exactly. I know a lot of people who you ask them, oh, how are you? And they'll say blessed. And it's a learned answer. You know what I mean? It's a learned response that, you know what, as a Christian, whether I feel this or not, that is the right answer. And it in a true sense, it is the right answer. But for him, it was not simply this thing that he was trying to attain to. He really was. He really felt that way. And his response was so sincere that, man, there is nothing that could make me happier. We were talking about this, is that for most of us, I would say, we have a place or we have circumstances where we identify as, you know what, this is my happy place, and it's not necessarily a location, but it can be, my happy place is the beach, right? Like you can get little things that say that, or, drinking with friends, or,
well, as a golfer, I used to call the golf course my heaven on earth. Before I
exactly. That's a great example. And I know a widespread example. But for Bob, his happy place was wherever he was.
Yes.
And that's what we want to attain to. That's what Christ invites us to, is to be in a place in life where the circumstances don't dictate your sense of peace, your sense of joy. The person in front of you doesn't dictate how loving you will respond. It is truly from your relationship with the Lord. And he lived that. And that's the great witness that he gave, is you saw that. We talked about this as well. He was one of those people at Mass. I was going to daily Mass for a while before I ever met Bob. But he was one of those people, you knew who he was before you knew him, because he stood out. And he stood out not in a necessarily gregarious, he wasn't a Cardinal Dolan. He was not this super outgoing personality. And so everyone knew who he was, kind of life of the party. He was quiet. He was reserved. He stood out in his humility. And that's a rare person who can pull that off, who is just in his everything about him. He just has that peace and that humility.
I got to switch gears just a little bit, because we have to touch on Bob loved to laugh.
Yeah.
He loved to laugh. And I think he enjoyed kind of laughing with me often. I was going to say at me, but he never laughed at me. He always just loved to laugh with me. And we were getting these conversations. He's like, what do you think Jesus is saying as he's listening to us? Like, and half the time he would go, you know what? I bet he's laughing.
Yeah.
Bob had this love for coffee. And part of the reason I think about this, and I feel like I want to laugh right now, and I just grabbed the cup of coffee off the table here as we're talking about.
Yeah.
Bob loved a cup of coffee, and there was not a cup of coffee that he would not have at any time of the day. He just loved it, but he was such a simple man.
Yes.
And coffee is like as simple as it gets.
It really is. I mean, it's the simple joys. He didn't have to be at the beach having coffee. Not that he would have turned that down, I suspect, but he didn't have to be, he didn't have to have these elaborate experiences. Just a cup of coffee with a friend.
He is the man that would drink a cup of coffee at the beach, by the way.
No doubt.
But I got to say this. So he would drink coffee faster than any human being I'd ever met.
Nice.
It's one of his unique skills, and we would laugh. He would say all the time, I'd be talking, and because that's how that worked. I just talked and talked and talked, and he would listen and ask questions, and I'd keep talking. But he would joke all the time. He would kind of hold up his cup, and it was kind of this indication that, like, all right, you need to take a breath, son. He would hold up his cup and go, there's a hole in this cup. And then he would just get up and go refill his coffee.
Nice.
And come back. And sometimes we would be in a very deep moment, but he would just need to sort of break the emotional sort of moment that we were in. And he would do it with laughter.
Kind of reset.
Yeah. And it was this just moment where I remember one time in doing so, he said, I wouldn't mind being the patron saint of coffee. And it's just something that I will never forget. But Jim, I got to challenge you on this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is a patron saint of coffee.
So I did know that. Yes. Yes.
Well, can you name who it is?
Well, so I know that there's a coffee house in Colorado on the CSU campus. And so I'm giving the listeners, this is a pause to give the listeners their chance to try and answer it. But it's
nobody even knew there was a patron saint of coffee, let alone.
Oh, Jody knows. She's probably out there saying it's Bob. Come on now. I don't know who it used to be, but it's Bob. But it's Drago.
Gosh,
Drago Coffee. That's their coffee house. And
so Saint Drago, can you name his nationality?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
I only know about 3 things about this saint.
I would love for it to be Colombian because that would be so fitting. But I suspect it's like Romanian.
I believe he's French.
Is he French?
Don't quote me on that. But
interesting.
Yeah.
See, Drago sounds very Eastern European to me.
Oh, it does.
Drago.
It does.
But okay, I'll just accept that.
All right. So, and I could be making that up. Like, we need to fact check that one.
Okay.
I believe he's French.
We'll check that for next episode.
Parlez-vous français?
Drago?
Je m'appelle Jeff et toi? My mom was a French teacher, right?
Oh, I didn't. See, I took Latin. I specifically took Latin in high school because I know that no one ever would be able to correct me. I'd be like, you're not a native Latin speaker.
I have nowhere to go with that sarcasm. Okay. So, I completely lost my train of thought.
We're talking about Bob, the new patron saint of coffee.
Yes. This is my question.
Maybe he can focus on espressos. But he didn't like espressos, huh?
He would doctor up his coffee a little bit, though. He would, he'd put a little cream in there.
You think he could be the patron saint of the creamer?
Question. This is a legit question that I do not know the answer to.
Okay.
And I'm going to feel like a real dunce if I ask this question and then reflect on it later and be like, oh, yeah, I already knew that answer. But sitting here at this particular moment, I'm drawing a blank. Can there be more than one patron saint of something?
I think so. Usually, and actually that's kind of what we were discussing, is usually there's some like fine distinction. So you have like a patron saint of cancer, but then you have different kinds of cancer. And so each kind gets its own patron saint. Or you'll have these general lost items. Well, then you might have like specific lost items sort of thing. So I suspect that it would be like coffee from a coffee house, or
there'd be some sort of specification.
Yes, that's
for it.
My understanding. Now I don't sort of know that from a doctrinal side. That's been my experience, is that usually when you sort of hone in, you find, oh, well, he's the patron, Drago's the patron saint of coffee. Well, this guy's the patron saint of coffee with creamer.
Well, I guess if there's a lesson that I can take away from this, Jim, is that I need to start adding cream to my coffee.
There you go.
Yeah.
Or however he doctored his.
Beautiful.
Or coffee jokes.
Coffee jokes, I like that one.
Yeah. And you can have specifically on the cup, there's a hole in this cup. I think that would be awesome.
Amen.
Hey, it's Jim again. You know, I'm the kind of guy that when he finds something really worthwhile, likes to tell people about it. So I wanted just a minute here to tell you about a line of Christ-centered clothing called God's Brand. I personally have several God's Brand items, pullovers, button-downs, a really nice quarter-zip fleece. They're stylish, and they help me represent my faith in everyday life. When you get a chance, check out godsbrand.com. They have all sorts of styles for almost any occasion. Again, they're at godsbrand, all one word, .com. Check it out. You'll be glad you did.
You know, and I think it's really important to bring up, Jim, when you hear, as we're reflecting in talking of his character and his presence and so forth and his faith, he was not a man that was born with this sort of persona.
Yeah.
Now, clearly Christ had this inside of him the whole time, but this is a man that worked in technology, worked for the Chicago Board of Trade, like had a real occupation in a very busy city. You think about this person we're describing,
Yeah.
and you think, man, this guy must have been a holy man from the moment he came out of the womb.
Right.
And I just think it's extremely important for the listeners to understand that these transformations, Christ is excited to transform hearts. And he's ready.
Yeah.
He wants us to be inspired by his love and by these stories. And he wants us to turn to him and surrender and begin to trust that in whatever circumstance you're in, whether you're on the beach or sitting in a coffee shop, it's really not different. You should be who you are, and that's a son or daughter of our Lord and our Savior.
Yeah. And I like what you said there with the surrender. And here's the thing about the surrender is that it is complete. You cannot half surrender. That's not a surrender at all. That's still fighting against it. A half surrender is meaningless, and there's no transformation in it. There's no new life to be given if there are still parts of ourselves that we hold to ourselves. Now, can Christ start there and continue to work on you? Yes, he can, because Christ is the Lord. But the more completely we surrender our lives to him, the more that we will find ourselves transformed and become a new light, a new Christ, right? A new anointed one, as our baptisms have made us, but we will live it out in such a way that we will then be a light for those around us. And you can't overstate what an impact that will have on your life, on your family, on the people around you. You just can't. It will be more than a person can imagine if we just give ourselves to the Lord. Whatever is hard, especially what's hard. And Bob is a witness to, as you said, he is an example, number one, of Christ's willingness, desire even, to transform each of us. And he did it with abandon. And you and I saw the fruits of that. We saw the fruits of it. We didn't get to see the transformation. We simply saw, he looked like Moses walking in, I'm surprised there weren't times that we didn't have to put a veil over his face, So, but he really looked like one of those people that you saw from afar. Okay, something special is going on here, and I want it. He invited you forward. And again, he still does, quite honestly, because we know who he is, and we know that he is interceding on our behalf, and we know that he's in the presence of the Lord, and that he is seeking our best before the Lord. And so there's still all of that in that relationship. Yeah,
you put so much on the table right there, but I want to touch on one particular point, and it is sort of this infectious impact that he has, because not only has he had a deep and profound impact on many people, more than we could ever possibly count, and more that he would ever know, to be quite honest with you. But specifically, he had an opportunity to really kind of get close with my wife and with my children. He and his wife really have had a tremendous impact on our home and on our kids, to the point where they considered him, I'm doing the air quotes here, but their spiritual grandfather.
Yeah.
And they thought of his wife as their spiritual grandmother.
That's beautiful.
And they just, I think, saw this profound love that was different than the relationship they have with both sets of their grandparents, who are both living, who my wife and children and I love unconditionally.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
But this is just a different perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it really describes the vine and the branches, right? Like when Christ speaks of, I am the vine, you are the branches. Well, branches, they come off of other branches. And what comes off of that branch, then, you never get to see further down. So the impact that your kids are going to have, he'll never see. Well, he will see that, but he won't experience that on earth. But the life that they give and the people that they touch are going to be a continued fruit of Bob's impact on you and on your family. I mean, that's just the truth.
We are buds on that branch of life.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
And I know that he will be present in their hearts and in their minds and in their prayers forever.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And it's funny, our 9-year-old daughter, she called him Mr. Bob.
Yeah.
Which I just love.
Yeah.
It really,
it's respectful and intimate. It's both.
It is. Well, it's beautiful because she has a very gentle soul.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a soul that was very much like his.
Mm.
And they connected so quickly and so deeply, Jim, that their bond was more unique than...
Oh, sure.
Than I could probably do justice trying to describe. But she tells me now, Dad, I had a great conversation with Mr. Bob today.
Oh, I love that.
And she will talk to him in the silence of her prayer.
Yeah. Today.
Yeah. Now. And they talk. And it's hilarious because sometimes she's like, it sounds kind of like, Dad, I couldn't even hang up the phone because he's talking my ear off. And she's like, okay, Mr. Bob. Okay. I hear you. I know. I miss you too.
Yeah.
It's that kind of love and just genuine comfort with the fact that while his physical presence is no longer here in this earthly kingdom, his spirit is so alive.
Oh, for sure.
And I want to make one other comment here. Sorry. Like I said, my wife's parents and my parents are all still living. For my 9-year-old daughter and for my 12-year-old daughter, this was their first real experience with death.
Right.
And as a parent going through that with a young child, I wasn't really sure how we would navigate those waters.
Yeah.
But what is so beautiful is when you can just give those worries or that concern or that fear away. There was no need to try and sugarcoat what was happening.
Right.
And I knew that the Holy Spirit would guide those moments, would guide those and navigate those emotional waters. I didn't have to worry about showing up with answers.
Yeah.
But you always knew the one thing we always knew was that he was still there. He was still present.
That's so important too. And you're speaking of what I'm hearing as you're talking is Christ's words that unless you become like little children, right? They just see what is true. And the truth is that we are in the midst. We are surrounded, right? Going back to the letter to the Hebrews, we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. And he is among those witnesses. He is right here in our midst because he is with the Lord, and that union with the Lord is not broken. You know, we are united together in the Lord. And St. Paul says that nothing can take us away from that. So it is totally natural to have a conversation. But we get kind of caught up in what we can see and hear, and we lose sight of the fact that there's reality beyond that. And that reality is no less true because it's unseen. In fact, in some ways, it's more eternal.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Blazing Bush Podcast. Be sure and check out our website at blazingbush.com, as well as follow and like Blazing Bush on Instagram and Facebook. Until next time, God bless.